Welcome back, AP, to your last flip of the year. All right, so in about a day and a half, you guys will be taking your AP test, right? Some of y'all who are seeing this flip that don't even go to Canon Catholic and you're some weird person on the internet are like, well, why is he doing a crash course since 1945? Shouldn't he got to this content in the first place? Well, since we focused so heavily on the content from time periods 1, 2, 3, and the first half of 4, or actually the first 3 quarters of 4, that gives you the ammunition to do the big stuff. Write your DBQ, write your LEQ, things like that. And the years following 1945 are defined by one crucial concept: Cold War, which is a concept that many of you are actually already a little bit more comfortable with, right? So let's go ahead and crash course this whole thing. Let's not waste a ton of time. But in case you see some things pop up on the AP Euro test that was referencing to the Cold War, let's give you some guidance on how to answer those questions, all right? So Europe, since 1945, crash course, let's go. So first of all, European history during this time period is going to be defined by a lot of different things. There'll be keywords at the top of the slide, and then I'm just throwing up some cool pictures, all right? So first and foremost, displacement. You have a massive number of Europeans following World War II that are going to be displaced from their homes and having to literally move or migrate to different areas, right? Many of them are going to stay like within the continent, moving from places like Germany to Switzerland or vice versa, or but a heavy amount of movement due to the fact that it wasn't a lot like World War I. World War I was a battle that happened in fields and trenches and isolated areas, even though citizens were dramatically impacted by World War I as well. World War II was an urban warfare. It was fought in the streets, it was fought in alleyways, it was fought on sidewalks that people would use every day, right? So due to this, and due to the lightning-style war of Hitler, and due to the bombing runs of the different allies and Axis powers, right, heavy amounts of damage are going to be incurred, leading to massive repair efforts and huge displacement, all right? So this right here is the chain bridge that exists in Budapest, Hungary. This is the, oh wait, no, don't do that, stop it. All right, this is the chain bridge fully now, okay? Look how do I, there's a way to do this. There it is. That is Budapest at night. Look at how gorgeous that is, right? That is the chain bridge. That is the Buda Castle in the back, right? So this is the chain bridge in Budapest following World War II, all right? So as you can see, massive construction is going to be needed, right? Cities are bombed out. The city of Berlin now is like the second city of Berlin, okay? Nagasaki and Hiroshima are destroyed, okay? Parts of London are in carnage because this new style of like lightning-based strikes using bombing runs and things like that have left Europe in disrepair, leading again to displacement, heavy amounts of movement of people, and large repair efforts, right? And then the other biggest one was, what do we do following the Holocaust? How do we deal with the losers of the war and the biggest loss of life the world has ever seen, right? Because in the neighborhood of 50 million people died during World War II. 50 million. So deaths during World War II. Let's just double check that number. 70 million people died in World War II, including civilians, all right? So that is a massive number. 27 million of those people were Russian soldiers and Russian civilians during the stormings of Stalingrad and Leningrad, right? So the biggest one, though, that is now like the mark upon every human soul is the Holocaust, right? How do we deal with those people? Well, they're going to have these things known as the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials are going to be set up in Germany to put Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity, all right? Many of them are going to be found guilty. Many of them are going to be executed. So, the Nuremberg Trials. So you got kind of picking up the pieces after World War II a little bit, right? Then you're going to be continuing to pick up the pieces, and it's going to lead to something no one saw coming: the Cold War, right? The Cold War is a product of trying to collectively fix Europe and rebalance the power following World War II. Because in a way, the territorial gains of Hitler kind of similarly look like the territorial gains of Napoleon, right? Large swaths of land, almost the entire continent of Europe occupied, with the exception of a few allied states, right? So, just like the Congress of Vienna is going to be there to chop up Napoleon's lands and regain the balance of power, the Yalta and Potsdam conferences are going to be there to fix the balance of power in Europe. Yalta taken care of in southern Russia, right, on Stalin's home turf. And then Potsdam is going to be taking place in, let me see, double check, make sure I'm right. Yeah, Potsdam, Germany. All right, so these conferences are going to be made to create a more balanced Europe, right? Now, at the Potsdam conference, I don't believe FDR was there because, as we can see, FDR is ailing. He's getting much, much older, all right? So FDR doesn't even see the end of World War II fully. He sees the end of he sees VE Day, victory in Europe, but he never sees the full end of World War II. As we know, Truman decided to drop the bombs on Japan. But you have a new big three that emerges out of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. You've got Churchill, FDR, Stalin right here. So you've got England, the United States, and the new Soviet Union. All right, so the Soviet Union now includes the satellite states of Russia, including Poland, the Ukraine, and several other different areas. We'll get into a couple other ones here in a minute. But that's the Soviet Union, right? And then you've got FDR, of course, representing the United States, and you've got Churchill. Now, the biggest fear at the Yalta and the Potsdam Conference was this right here: the Eastern and Western blocks, right? So, during the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the biggest things they were trying to figure out were, how do we rebalance the power of Europe? Well, the problem was that if you look at the gains of the Soviet Union took on a huge swath of land, including Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania, giant swaths of land. These areas will be called their satellite states, right? So all of these are going to be put under socialist control, okay? Now, following the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, many diplomats tried to convince Stalin to release several of these areas. Stalin, however, was not having it. There are a lot of political cartoons of the Yalta and the Potsdam conference as a poker game, and Stalin's just raking in all the chips, right? So the Soviet Union saw huge territorial gains because, yet again, the Soviets did one crucial thing as far as Stalin was concerned. They held off the Nazis for 3 years, allowing time for the two-front war to continue, right? They then also reconquested this entire area away from Hitler. So under the guise of Stalin saying, we will be here to make sure nothing like that ever happens again, they are now a part of our Soviet Union. So Churchill and FDR are going to relent, and they're going to allow him to keep these things, creating the Eastern Bloc, which is in everything in blue, and then the Western Bloc. And then, of course, right here is the famous Churchill speech. We have fallen behind an iron curtain, right? Literally a giant figurative line separating the communist East from the capitalist West, right? So a crazier thing that's even going to happen during the Yalta and Potsdam conferences is the division of Germany. Now, following the suicide of Hitler and also, as we saw back after World War I, the inabilities of the Weimar Republic and things like that, Germany's going to be split into 4 districts, okay? It's going to be split into an American district, a British district, a French district, and then you've got the Soviet district, right? Which, unfortunately, within the Soviet district is where the capital city of Berlin is, right? So they then decide to split Berlin into 4 quadrants: a French district, a British district, an American district, and a Soviet district. Now, as time continues to progress, France and Britain are going to withdraw and give their consolidated holdings over to the United States for their ability to look over. And then the Soviets are going to lock down East Germany. Now, the crazy thing that happens, though, is the Soviets never leave, leading to a country known as East Germany the country known as West Germany all the way up until 1991. All right, so this is a huge thing. And then, of course, you've got Truman. Good old Harry. All right, so Harry S. Truman and his big Truman Doctrine, which I know you've heard about in US 1 already. The Truman Doctrine is all about one big thing. Stalin has gained so much territory in Europe, right? We need to contain communism. The Truman Doctrine is all about containment. Allow the countries that are already communist to remain communist, but do not allow it to go any further, all right? So Truman has a lot of ideas about this, right? But one of the most crucial ones is actually introduced by one of his secretaries, Marshall, all right? The Marshall Plan is going to be massively important. The Marshall Plan is best defined by an influx of money and an influx of economic assistance to capitalist countries of Western Europe, right? The Western Bloc. Also, you saw heavy influence trying to convince Eastern Bloc countries that capitalism was what was progressive and what was the way. This is a very famous picture from the Berlin airdrop, right? Or the Berlin airlift, as many people call it, where literally the United States, under the Marshall Plan, flew large repurposed bombers from World War II to drop supplies onto communist East Germany, right? To show them that capitalism and the Western Bloc are the way, right? We are the way to go. Now, here's the thing. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, right? The containment ideas of giving money and economic assistance to the Western Bloc is not going to be the only time that happens. A lot of time, U.S. teachers are always like, oh, and then the Marshall Plan, and that's it, and then they move on, right? The Soviets had their own, okay? The Soviets also came up with a way to try and encourage economic assistance within their satellite states. Okay, it's abbreviated as the COMCON, or COMECON, which stands for the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance. Okay, so an idea of a unifying Soviet practice of redistributing collectivized agriculture, bread, wheat, grains, as well as money to these different satellite states to keep the people stable, right? So, because what's a big key component of communism? Stability, right? So they're going to also do a lot of other things. They're going to outlaw a lot of capitalist items, right? Like, for example, there's this crazy little car that they used to make in East Germany. So let me show you if I can show you real quick. East German car. There it is. All right, so yeah, the East German Trabant. All right, like, so they're going to outlaw a ton of different vehicle makers, particularly Ford and Chevrolet and GM products, and they're going to push that on them as part of their COMCON and their economic assistance programs, right? So then you're going to see a massive growth. The Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, we're never just going to stay there. Now you're entering in with these new economic concepts, right? With the Marshall Plan, COMCON, right? Now you're entering into a concept where it's like, we have to trade. We have to make money. We have to be international. Well, the Eastern Bloc isn't going to trade with the Western Bloc because that would encourage capitalism within the walls of the Soviet Union. So how do we accomplish this? They create two new trade organizations. There's the North American Trade Organization, known as NATO, which is all the countries in blue, and then there is the Warsaw Pact, created in Poland, which is all the countries in red, okay? So it even continues to expand, and these tensions begin to grow as basically two giant powers that represent the two dominant economic systems stare each other down, waiting for war or waiting for something to happen. Man, and tensions are going to grow, right? The Cold War is going to just keep bubbling up, right? It's just going to keep bubbling up. And they particularly grow in 1949 when the Soviets test their first successful nuclear weapon, all right? So in 1949, it begins the nuclear arms race, okay? So two great examples of growing tensions throughout the Cold War are the development of nuclear arms and the Berlin Wall. Now, granted, these things are 11 years apart, right? Because the very first model of the Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961 and didn't fall until 1991, right? So, but it's just a sign of the tension, because there was massive defecting from East Germany to West Germany. And so the Soviets decided to erect a wall to stop them. There was a massive gap in arms between the Americans and the Soviets. So the Soviets, using spies and intelligence, rip off the design of the nuclear weapons and test and model their own, right? They then begin to also give assistance to other third world nations, which actually the third world, first world, second world classification system came up during this period, right? So during this period, two things came up actually. The first world, second world, third world classification, where first world was capitalist, second world was communist, and third world was the battleground states. Because here's the thing, the Berlin Wall represents perfectly the ideals of the Cold War. Keep capitalism in the West. Let us grow communism in the East. So your third world countries, your battleground states, are undeveloped, economically undeveloped countries that are waiting to be claimed by the capitalist or Soviet powers, right? So you've got massive expansion in China, North Korea, Vietnam. Containment is not working, Truman. They are growing, right? So also not to mention the fact that with the nuclear weapons and the massive arms race, so brought on later a concept known as MAD, or mutually assured destruction, where basically we were standing off with one another the entire time being like, if you fire at me, I'm going to fire at you. And if you actually do that, then the entire world ends. So mutually assured destruction is the thing that kept us from actually launching those nuclear weapons at one another. But as these tensions begin to grow, it also doesn't help that the Soviets are being led by one man, all right? So, yeah, one guy, all right? So, unfortunately, I'll be able to keep this hair, and I won't have to deal with this problem. So, the Cold War, as American students and American academics, we can actually understand that the Cold War is measured a lot by its leaders, right? The Cold War, seriously, is measured mostly by its leaders. And from Stalin to the guy who ended up dissolving the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, there's two major figures between them. But one of them is the one we're going to focus on, and he's this guy. This is the premier of Russia, like their leader, following Stalin's death in 1953, after he has a stroke in his bed, and like he had told his guards never to come in there, and he's yelling for help, and they don't actually come help him, and he ends up dead. Nikita Khrushchev takes over following the death of Stalin, all right? He is the Soviet premier through the Eisenhower administration, through the, who else? Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, and Nixon regimes, all right? So this guy was around for a ton of time, okay? So I was trying to explain this to a kid the other day, that we always measure, I hate this pen, it just bled into my pants, great. All right, we always measure American leaders by a short swath of time, like 8 years a pop, right? The Soviets were being led by one man until he died, or until he actually stepped back or retired, right? So with Khrushchev being in charge, he is now going head to head with a lot of these new capitalist leaders, right? But Khrushchev is going to, ironically enough, try to steer the Soviet Union along a path of decentness. The big thing he tries to do is this program called De-Stalinization, which is a liberalization or a relaxation of the Stalin initiatives following World War II. Stalin wanted a straight-up Leninism, Lenin-esque ruling status, but he wanted it all over his satellite states as well, right? So there are massive statues erected to Stalin. You have collectivized agriculture under Stalin. You have the suppression of capitalist ideals under Stalin. Blue jeans were outlawed, right? So all kinds of insane stuff like that. Khrushchev comes in, though, and says, we are going to relax some of these things. We're going to allow minor capitalist influxes. We are going to try and meet them in the middle. And we are also going to release some of these Soviet states that we have no business having. Like, for example, Austria was released under Khrushchev, right, from Soviet control. Now, so Khrushchev's trying to do his best on one hand. The de-Stalinization movements within the Soviet Union are genius. De-Stalinization, as in no more Stalin. De-Stalinization. It's genius. But then you've got stuff like this, Khrushchev. You got the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because he is trying to support his people. The big thing that we always see when we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis as Americans, we're like, oh, those dirty Soviets and putting their nuclear weapons in Cuba too close to us. We had weapons in Turkey. So, it was borderline the same thing, all right? So Khrushchev honestly was just trying to create an even playing field, right? But the Cuban Missile Crisis would be a really large thing that defines him, right? Which actually ends up being a very, very well negotiated crisis because we removed our missiles from Turkey and they removed their missiles from Cuba, right? So, like, Khrushchev and JFK avoided possible nuclear warfare, right? Stalin, I think, might have fired one. Khrushchev didn't, all right? So, Nikita Khrushchev. Then you've got this massive thing. So, the Cold War tensions are very, very aggressive, right? Then you've got decolonization. So this entire map of Africa, as we know during the 1880s, was completely colonized by white Europeans, all right? When the League of Nations failed and the United Nations was established, and whenever we entered into the concept of post-World War First World, the biggest program was decolonization. All imperialist colonies must be given up. Granted, it can be gradual. It can be a gradual rate, but they must be given up, all right? So, Britain, give up India, all right? Britain, give up parts of Africa. Britain, give up the rest of the world too, please. All right, so decolonization was a massive progression forward. Africa was slowly liberated. Now, this was not a snap of the fingers type of thing. As we know, in India, the movements of Gandhi and his pacifist movements were actually a very slow process that led to the liberation of India, right? As we know, in several other areas, though, it was almost an immediate one, leading to government instability. Japan, for example, controlled Korea. When they left immediately following their loss of the war, communist China is going to influence North Korea to go communist, and then South Korea is going to be convinced by the Americans to go capitalist. Korean War breaks out later, right? We'll get to that here in a second. But then you're also going to have post-war and colonial migration. Whenever you Google colonial migration following the war, you see a heavy amount, or post-war migration, you see a heavy amount of white Europeans moving, particularly to places like America, particularly to places like industrialized South America, right? A lot of different areas, right? They're actually moving and making new lives for themselves outside of Europe, right? Colonial migration, ironically enough, saw a heavy movement into Europe, right? So following the decolonization of places like Africa and the Caribbean, you saw massive movements of people into Europe, right? Like there was a heavy movement of Jamaicans into Great Britain at one point, right? So then you're getting into, I get it. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry about that. As you can tell up in the top right corner, my Mac is running out of space because I record so many of these videos. Then we saw a relaxing of Cold War tensions in a movement known as the Detente, right? This was a huge movement for Europe because as the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc were still very prevalent, right? The Detente movements actually saw a relaxing of Cold War tensions due to the fact of some very solid leaders, but also due to the fact of this big movement known as the New Left, all right? Or the counterculture movement. I know Denny's going to be a massive fan of this cartoon right here, right? But sir, on an attack sub, think of it as camouflage. Now, anyway, also, fun fact, did you know that the peace sign is actually a merging of 2 letters, an N and a D, and it's for nuclear disarmament? Learned that yesterday. All right, so now, anyway, continuing forward, though, you saw a relaxing of these Cold War tensions. You saw a movement of missiles away from borders. You saw occupation ending. You saw high-level threats lessening, right? And a lot of it is due to this new left counterculture style, right? Because it's going to be impressing upon our governments to actually remove and pacify. But then on the flip side, you had what I call the wars of containment. The Truman Doctrine was holding on for dear life. And the wars of containment are the big wars that happened during this counterculture movement that led to them. All right, so before the counterculture movement and the New Left ever popped up, you had 2 massive wars of containment that the Europeans weren't heavily involved in, but actually Americans were, right? So you had the Korean War, which was a war of containment to try and prevent South Korea from actually further going communist, right? And then you had the Vietnam War, right? So with these massive movements of containment and these right movements of containment to try and prevent, not right as in correct, right as in political spectrum, to try and prevent communism from spreading, this new left counterculture movement was actually the product of those wars. Sick and tired of war, disgusted with this new concept and more concerned with the giant consumer culture that was growing, right, following World War I and growing into, international travel, right, growing into more vehicles, growing into a culture of which, is defined by the suburbs, leave it to Beaver, 2.5 kids, 2-car garage, and massive economic progression. These wars of containment are going to lead to this new left status, and it's going to be a very, very big problem, right? So because there is going to be a clashing. But the new left's biggest success was encouraging that détente, that relaxing of those Cold War tensions. And then you're going to also see massive holes, I guess you could say it, in the Swiss cheese that is the Soviet Union. As people begin to deal with being under Soviet rule less peacefully, all right? This right here is a picture from the 1956 Hungarian student riot, where many students were actually shot by Soviet military. They actually ripped a Stalin statue down and used a large bar to beat the face of it in, right? So you have all these satellite states beginning to rebel, leading to massive economic downfall of the Soviet Union, right? Because they have to spend money to move troops to actually quell these uprisings. A massive one of solidarity actually happened in Czechoslovakia. A huge one in Hungary occurred, right? The Hungarian student revolt in 1956 is something that defines them, right? But you're going to see massive revolts against communism in the Eastern Bloc, all right? So, and then, of course, you've got this guy. What a guy. Not Reagan. Calm down, Jules Baer. Gorbachev. Gorbachev becomes the final Soviet premier, right? And Gorbachev was best known for his attempts to try and create a more 20th century Soviet Union model. He introduced two constructs. Listen to me closely as I spell them. Perestroika, 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 and a thing called Glasnost, right? Two of his big initiatives. Perestroika was to try and create a hybrid economic system within the Soviet Union that allowed capitalism to exist, but still kept socialist ideals. And Glasnost was a way to try and make the Soviet government more transparent. No more Iron Curtain. Let the people know that what we're doing, right? So, unfortunately, though, the damage from these wars of containment, student revolts, and the new left are never going to be able to, the Soviets are never going to be able to bounce back. And in 1991, the Berlin Wall falls in November of 1991, and within a month, the USSR dissolves, all right? And that is Europe up to 1991, all right? So if you would like, I have some text that you can read up on going into the test, but you're not going to see much of anything past 1991. But that right there is a crash course in Europe since 1945. Hope you guys have a great one. We will study more today in class. We'll get you ready. I believe in you guys so hard. You guys are going to do great. See you later.